massive about it. Yes, people, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome back to another video. First things first, guys, make sure you smash up the like, subscribe if you're new around here, all of that good stuff. And as always, leave your thoughts in the comments. And we're in the midst of the international break. I know you guys are sick of it. We're all sick of it. But we're going to come at you today with some tactical chat about Chelsea this season under Enzo Maresca. And of course, I'm delighted to be joined by Connor. Mate, it's been a while since we've chatted about football and stuff. How you doing? You good?
I'm good, yeah. It has been a while. Don't think I've been on the channel. God, not been this season, definitely. Definitely was last year. So yeah, good to be back.
It has been a while. Obviously, look, we've had a bit of a mixed start to the season. Massive win against Liverpool last time out, which really, given us some momentum heading into the international break. We saw at the back end of the Club World Cup, Maresca slightly tweaking the tactics, certainly the back end of last season as well. It wasn't necessarily out and out touchline wingers. Certainly one side would tuck in a bit more and there'd be an overlapping fullback. I think we saw it with Cole Palmer and Gusto to great effect in that final against PSG. We've seen it on a couple of occasions this season. Remember West Ham away, Esteval was slightly tucked in and Gusto was overlapping. Is that something, that you think Maresca is going to roll out on a more consistent basis, or do you look at that as sort of personnel and game specific, and do you like it?
Yeah, I think that it's something he'll use more often. I think he's more willing to use it, especially, I mean, we saw it at times even before the Club World Cup. He wouldn't be completely opposed to using an overlapping fullback, but it all depended who you had in the pivot alongside Caicedo. What he didn't really want was Enzo to be alongside Caicedo in deeper areas as a fixed double pivot. What you'd instead see a lot of the time when Gusto's playing as that right wing back was, again, many people didn't like it, but it was Reece James playing in midfield, so that if Gusto was caught further forward as that overlapping right back, you'd actually have Reece James, who is technically playing in midfield, but he's there to be able to cover that gap whilst Gusto recovers. So what he wanted, and he said it as well a few times last season, earlier in the season, when Enzo Fernandez was sort of out the team and he had Lavia and Caicedo in a double pivot together, he spoke about how much he wants that sort of, if they're going to be fixed in a double pivot as a two, he wants that to be a lot more sort of solid and have that physicality level to it. So I do think that it depends a little bit on that. However, what we're seeing now, which I think is a brilliant way to utilize the overlapping fullbacks, and sort of, as you say, where we've seen it a little bit with Gusto, or we've seen it a little bit even with Reece James in a few games this season, I think what you're now seeing, where instead of starting with a fixed back three and then a fixed two in front, what you're now seeing in the last few games is almost starting with a four at the back, which can then shift and become sort of almost a 2-3 base instead of that 3-2, which allows those fullbacks to be a little bit more sort of configured with their movements. They can either overlap, they can invert, and they can do a bit of both, and it sort of protects the workload of those fullbacks, which allows James to get further forward. And I think his tactical role in this new sort of system, him and Cucurella, is extremely important. And we're going to see a lot of inverting and overlapping rather than just one or the other from now on.
Yeah, I think the fullbacks is an interesting one, mate, because obviously a lot in his first season last year, particularly at the start, a lot of it was inverting every time. It was Gusto inverting, giving the ball away loads. It was James inverting, perhaps not used to the role, and it wasn't working particularly well. Gusto, I remember in that Conference League final, was doing that inverting role. He had an absolute nightmare, and obviously was rightly removed at half time. Maresca now seems to have moved. I'm not saying he's not moved totally away from inverting, but some games someone will invert. Some games there'll be zero inverting, and some games there'll be proper pushing on overlapping fullbacks. Gusto, I think it definitely suits his game, or we know it suits his game to be that overlapping fullback. And Cucurella has shown that he can also do that. He was well advanced, obviously, for setting up that Esteval goal at the weekend against Liverpool. It's obviously good to have that flexibility, and it's good to see that, the fullbacks can perform multiple roles. So I think, different game states are going to dictate different ways that you need to utilize those fullbacks. I mean, what have you made of the use of the fullbacks and the fact that, some games will invert, some games will overlap, and some games will just be traditional fullbacks?
Yeah, I think it's been brilliant. I think that that's what's so good. I said it at the start of the season about our group of fullbacks. I think you've got a very tactically versatile set of fullbacks, which is extremely key for a manager like Maresca, who likes to change the build-up shape, likes to sort of make those adjustments mid-game. So for example, if you've got Cucurella inverting higher up in the pocket, in sort of in the 10, which we saw a little bit last season of him and Gusto playing higher up, but then you can sort of shift it mid game where they become a little bit more overlapping and you drag somebody else infield. It's having the ability to make those changes without having to make wholesale changes with subs. Whereas there's sort of a lot of teams would say, for example, one fullback, say Calafiori, he's actually probably a bad example because he's quite good at all of that as well. But having to like make lots of changes to then carry out a new tactical idea. I think what you have, especially with Cucurella and James, is they can carry out any of the roles you ask them to do. They can play as that wide centre back. They can invert into the double pivot and play a little bit deeper. They can play higher up in the pocket. Yes, of course, we have the sort of question marks on James's fitness, but you can't question his actual ability to play out those roles because it's top. And then as an overlapping fullback again, that's exactly where people want to see Reece. So having that tactical flexibility, I think, is huge for a manager like Maresca. And I think that now it just allows him to sort of go into each game and really look to target specific areas of teams. I think against Manchester United, not Manchester United, Liverpool, they purposely spoke about tactically aiming for that left hand side or right hand side of Liverpool because Mo Salah doesn't really tend to track. He looks to sit in that rest attack position really high up. So Cucurella's role in that game was to sort of drift off the shoulder, start in that sort of nominal left back position, and then slowly make his way forward in the blind side of Mo Salah, and then essentially give yourself a 2v1 with Garnacho or Gittins later in the game against Conor Bradley, and that worked really well, or Szoboszlai later in the second half. So that worked really well in this game, and I think it's those sort of tweaks that it allows you to make or sort of go into with different game plans that makes our fullback set probably one of the best in the league, if you ask me.
No, I definitely agree. Certainly, of Cucurella and James, I don't think there's a better fullback pairing in the Premier League. Gusto is improving as well, still young, but if you play to his strengths, he is one of the best. Just briefly on Jerel Ho, obviously we haven't really seen much of him at left back. He's obviously had to play a bit more at centre back for injury reasons and whatnot. He looked decent at centre half when he has played. How do you see him adapting to the left back role and what's required to play left back in the Maresca system?
It's been interesting. I said when he first joined, I had a few sort of reservations of him playing a little bit deeper in the double pivot when he inverts because he is so one-footed in terms of how he looks to progress the ball. He's trying to always force the pass on his left. All of his touches, even when he's carrying the ball, tend to be on his left as well. He doesn't really have that same option to open up as some other players do. So I was a little bit worried that he could be sort of targeted as a pressing point a little bit deeper in midfield, but he has all the raw sort of traits and abilities. We saw it when he came on against Liverpool. He's so comfortable on the ball in those central areas that when he almost got pressed by 4 or 5 players, swarmed at one point, and he sort of navigated all three, like all 4 or 5 of them, and played the ball forwards. Like he has that ability, no matter where he is on the pitch. But I do think that it's going to take a little bit of time, especially physically with the Premier League. It's different kettle of fish. And I think we saw that especially against, I think it was Brighton, where he was taken off because we sort of Danny Welbeck came on. They started to get a few more balls into the box. And we, of course, had 10 men at that point with Hato and Achempong as the two central defenders. And I think that Maresca was a little bit worried about the sort of the aerial and box defending and aerial presence of that pairing, especially with the inexperience of both of them. So I do think that he's got a little bit of physicality to sort of work with. Like his base level is good in terms of what he is. He's a smaller central defender slash like fullback hybrid. I do still think that his best role is as the left centre back in a three. So starting as a left back, but becoming that left centre back on the ball. And then essentially having the central centre back and a right centre back, and then maybe the right back pushes up a little bit higher. But of course, Cucurella, that's his main role. So with Hato, I think it's perfect in this season where he can be a bit of a backup for that role. Hopefully, get some minutes in the tank there, but also get some minutes in that central, like in the centre back position, like we've seen. To one, feed him the minutes that he needs to develop, but two, also just to sort of give Maresca options on again if we build up with a two and he's playing as that left centre back, he can be quite useful. I think in the Brighton game in the first half where we was building up in that back four and he was the left centre back. I thought he was really, really good in that first half. So there's a lot of sort of usage you can get from Hato, but I do think it's going to take a little bit of time to get the full package of what you can really see with him, maybe pushing up into higher areas on the pitch like Cucurella.
No, for sure. I mean, and just on obviously centre back is a big point of discussion at Chelsea. Obviously, Maresca didn't get the centre back to replace Colwell that he wanted. we've had a lot of injury issues for the Liverpool game. Chalobah, Tosin, Fofana should all be back for after the international break. We've got Action-Pong, we've got Badiashile as well. Maresca needs to find a partnership and stick with that partnership, because the goalkeeper and the back two, centre backs, so important to have continuity there. And we've seen time and time again with Chelsea, there's been so much chopping and changing from game to game in terms of the centre back partnership. What do you think is the best partnership to go forward with for the remainder of this season? Because I would have said maybe Maresca was thinking it might be Chalobah and Fofana, purely based on the fact that he started both of them against United and he started both of them against Lincoln. Do you think that is the best partnership? What do you think the best partnership is going forward with the options we've got for the remainder of the season? Because we've got to stick with a partnership.
Yeah, I think this is where it gets tough, right? Because I do think that the best partnership, and I think in Maresca's mind, what he would probably want to do is probably Badiashile and Fofana as a two. However, Fofana, like you just said, in terms of continuity, it's really hard to plan with a trying to keep continuity with a player like Wesley Fofana, who you cannot rely on for a long period and a long stretch of time. So maybe it ends up being Badiashile and Chalobah. I do think that he had. I've said it for a long time. Even when it was Colwell, there was times where he tried to pair them together, because I do think that Maresca really actually likes Badiashile, and I think he's been
Yeah.
proven right really with the last few performances from Badiashile. He's been really really good in those last few games, especially against Liverpool. I thought he's excellent. But I do think that Maresca has a clear soft spot for him. And I do think it's, if you can keep him fit, it's about who you pair with him. So on the sort of angle of continuity, like you said, I do think someone like Trev is probably your best option in terms of he gives a little bit of everything, a bit of experience, a bit of durability. He can be the aggressor next to Badiashile. He can also sort of play in a 2 or a 3 on the ball. He gives you a few different options. So yeah, I think it's going to be a tough one, because I think as well we know how much Maresca loves Wes. So I do think if Fofana's fit, then it probably will be Badiashile and Fofana, or even say Fofana or Trev, like you said. But then there comes the issue of keeping that continuity, because if Fofana goes down injured, then you lose that straight away again. How often does that get juggled? How often do you have to sort of manage Fofana in the same way that you have with Reece and Lavia? All of those questions come into doubt, but I do think it's between those three, and then hopefully Josh sort of gets those minutes sort of chucked in as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Action-Pong is someone that Chelsea fans obviously want to see more of. He was very good against Liverpool. I think he actually was very good dealing with Mateta on the opening day
Yes.
against Palace. But we then didn't really see him for a number of games, and he's kind of back in the side now, mainly probably down to injuries, unfortunately, from his perspective. Do you just feel that? Do you reckon Maresca thinks that he's just not quite ready to step in and be that main guy week in, week out? And who do you think out of what we've got is kind of best suited to replicating that Colwell role? Passes, breaking the line, stepping up, kind of starting the build up play, because that's been a thing that we've struggled with as well, is the building up from the back in Colwell's absence.
Yeah. Firstly on Achempong, I think I think Maresca actually does really, really like him, and I think like he pointed him out a few times last season. But I do think he's maybe tried to be a bit careful with that sort of progression of him, because we have got such a young core anyway. I think that having that sort of experienced head at the back, especially without Colwell, who is that as well for us. I do think he's trying to be somewhat careful with him and sort of use him in a protected manner. Of course, we all want to see more of him. I think his talent is like undeniable. I think he's absolutely top. So hopefully we do see more of him. In terms of that passing out from the back, it's weird because we're talking about like the best centre back pairings and stuff, but the one that really replicates that, and the only one that really replicates that for me, is the one that we didn't mention. It's Tosin. It for me, in terms of a line breaking passer, I think that's the one area that I do really trust him. If you're going to play with a 3 and have a central centre back instead of the 2 that we've been doing recently, building up with a 4, I do actually think that Tosin is the best for that role. But he's also had a few errors this season in terms of sort of defending space. I think the one
Yeah, his
against Shard was
1v1
great.
defending is really
Yeah,
poor.
he sort of looks to back off and almost sit on the back foot and almost just predict where they're going to go, ready to put a block in, rather than being a little bit more proactive, and trying to sort of take away their space in the first place. He allows them to sort of take that space for themselves. Um, so that's an issue in itself. And I think that is part of the reason, of course, he's injured, as like he had a few injury issues himself. But I do think that's part of the reason we're looking to go into this sort of 2 or 4 at the back build up, but basically becoming a 2-3 rather than a 3-2. I keep referring to it as, so that you can have not only Casado sort of fixed in that pivot, who can drop a little bit deeper and get on the ball, and we saw that even against Palace a little bit, but also you can have both a left footer as the left centre back, a right footer as the right centre back, and they can almost take up those roles predominantly on the ball and have very good passing angles forward. And we've seen that to quite good effect. Badiashile playing as a left centre back rather than a central centre back. Very, very good angles. And he's a very good progressive passer. He's probably the best outside of Colwill and Tosin in terms of breaking those lines. But I do think Tosin is maybe just slightly better suited to a central centre back role than Badiashile, purely on the fact that Tosin he's a little bit more disguised with his passing. He's a little bit quicker to open up those angles. Badiashile may actually have a better pass on him. I just think that it's maybe sometimes a little bit more broadcast and can sometimes get cut out a little bit easier, even though I do heavily rate him for his passing ability.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting on the defense, and it's something that I think is going to probably change a lot over the course of the season, even though, we know we need that continuity there. I just wanted to round out with a bit of talk about the attack and, Joao Pedro in particular, because he started the season really well. Last few games, I know he's not really been fully fit, but that number 9 role, playing up front on his own, without a creative number 10 behind him, it doesn't work for him. Against Liverpool, had 1 shot in the game, no shots on target. He looks very isolated up there. I feel if you're going to play him as a 9, you need a creative 10 behind him, whether that's a Palmer or ideally a Cole Palmer. That's going to get the best out of Joao Pedro in the 9. He's gone with Enzo Fernandez in that more advanced role with a 2 behind him midfield. Obviously, Caicedo and Gusto against Liverpool, but now Lavia's back. Probably see Caicedo and Lavia pivot, maybe with Enzo pushed further forward. Do you think Maresca now realising, now that he thinks that Guu is actually potentially ready to contribute, having got his first minutes against Liverpool, what do you think we might see more of him starting and Pedro dropping into that 10, where he arguably is probably more effective? What are your thoughts on that dynamic, Pedro on his own without a creative 10 behind him? And do you think Guu's now going to finally see some more minutes? Because Pedro up there on his own in the role that he's doing now is not really working.
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me because I made a video after the West Ham game talking about this exact thing straight, even before the Delap injury was like really sort of known and how big it was going to be. That I do think that especially against back fives, Joao Pedro has to be that sort of number 10 and have somebody ahead of him doing the sort of dirty work, especially with 3 central defenders for the opposition. And we saw Delap do that to unbelievable effect against West Ham. I thought he was unbelievable in that game, despite not getting a goal or an assist with 5 goals being scored. Went completely under the radar how good he actually was, because I thought he was brilliant. And his role there is to pin that back line and make space for someone like Joao Pedro, who can then receive in the 10. Against back fours, I don't actually have an issue with starting Pedro as the 9, because it does make sense, because when you've got 2 central defenders, and if you can pull one out, which happened on quite a few occasions against Liverpool, Konate would get pulled out, and Liverpool's actually a really good example of that working to good effect, because Liverpool are one of the main teams in the league that don't like to bring a defender out of that back line. Quite a few actually want to be man-to-man, but Konate and Van Dijk often like to stay home and try and not come out, but Joao Pedro drags them away. And that was really good to have someone like Gusto who would make them runs in behind. Now, it didn't really account for anything. It didn't lead to any of the goals. But I do think it makes a lot more sense when he is up top against the back 4 and he can sort of work with that. However, when he's playing in that 5, I 100% agree. I think he needs to be more involved on the ball. And I think that, as you said, with the lack of creator, I do think that's another factor. I think that you're putting one of your best players in a position that he's maybe not going to. He's playing more of sort of a support role when he's a number 9 against a back 4, because, like I said, his role is to drag players away. He's not going to be the guy that's sort of making things happen. He's in there to serve a purpose, and it's going to be the other players that are getting into the advantageous positions because of his sort of selfless work. Whereas, if anything, it was Delap doing the selfless work again when he's attacking in a back 5, and Pedro's the one benefit from it. So I do think you've got to find that balance, and especially when Cole is out, and if you're not going to start Esteval. So if you're going with a lineup that has no Cole or no Esteval, then I do agree. I think you need to find a way to maximise Pedro's touches on the ball more and get him into better areas to succeed. Not only playmaking, but also just shots. Like he's been averaging about 1.4 shots this season, nowhere near good enough for your striker. But again, it's because of the sort of selfless role that he's having to play within this team right now with the rest of the dynamics of it. So it's a weird one for me with Pedro, but I see the logic starting him as a 9 against back fours. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it needs the right pieces around him for it to work.
Do you think Mark Guu is going to have a bit more of a say? Now, obviously, Delap not due back in training until next month. You know, it could be looking at December until he's actually fit and ready to actually start playing minutes. So we are looking at still a significant amount of games without him. Maresca has obviously spoken about Guu not really being ready. He didn't feel he got first minutes instead against Liverpool. Do you think now could be the time in this next run of games? You know, we've got slightly favourable fixtures. You've got Forest away, you've got Sunderland at home, Ajax at home in the Champions League where there is no Joao Pedro, and then you've got Wolves away in the Carabao. Do you think in this stretch of games we could now start to see Guu? And how do you see him kind of his role within this system?
Yeah, I think especially against those back five teams. So I'm trying to think. I think Ajax, like you say, he'll have to play. I think against Wolves, Gui could play quite a big part because I think in that game it'd be silly to go into that game with João Pedro as the starting number 9. I think in that one specifically, it'd be quite good to see Gui start up front and João Pedro starting behind him. Against Forest, who are now playing quite a bit of a higher line under Ange and in a back four, I do think maybe João Pedro to start with him as a 9 is probably the most sensible. But again, I think you even in those games where he is starting as the 9, I think now that we've seen Gui come from the bench and we know that it's because I think the question mark with Gui before was, are they purposely not using him because they want to get rid of him in January because of the 3 club rule? Now that we've seen him, we know that's not a thing. We know he's going to be here for the season. So now that you've used him, there's no excuses. So I do think that now we'll see him a lot more from the bench than we have. But yeah, I think against those back four teams, Forest and who did you say the one after Forest was?
Oh, we've got Ajax in the Champions League, and then we've got Sunderland at home.
Sunderland. I think Sunderland they usually play in a 4, but then against us they could play in a 5. So that would maybe depend. I would say Pedro starts as a 9 against Forest, and then we see Guiu a little bit, especially against Wolves. He could play a big part starting as that number 9.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic because, like, I mean, we can say that Maresca can say that he likes Gui or whatever, but the evidence last season suggested that he don't really rate him. I know he was injured for a lot of that second part of the season, but that first part of the season he was barely used. Yeah, I think he will have to use him because the other alternative is Tyreek George, which again is not good enough for what we're looking to do. I just want to briefly, very quickly touch on wingers before we round out. We've got Garnacho, Gittins, Esteval, Neto, etc. I think Esteval has done much more impact than maybe a lot of us would have thought. And I don't think some people might have thought this, but I certainly didn't think he'd be in October talking about this guy has to be starting every week for us, which I think we're actually at the point now. So my question to you is, what do you think the best wing pairing is? Because for me personally, I would say maybe it's Pedro Neto on the left and Esteval on the right, but you could also maybe put in a Garnacho if you're going to go an actual out-and-out left winger. But for you, does Esteval have to be in that starting combination?
He does because Cole is out. I think even more so, you need that sort of player who is like the heavy sort of ball top. Like he gets a lot of touches on the ball in the final third, and he's the guy to sort of make things happen and pull players towards him. I think in Cole's absence, he absolutely has to be starting. I saw a quote yesterday. I'm sure you've seen this. And I was saying this, I recorded a video yesterday and I was talking about it. And I both love and hate this quote that Esteval already feels like when he gets the ball, the whole, like the Chelsea fan that's the
Yeah.
Stamford Bridge is expecting something from him. And I'm so conflicted on that quote because I both absolutely love it and absolutely hate it because it's exactly what you want. You want him to feel confident. You want him to feel sort of really inspired to play his game and to do what he's best at. But at the same time, it's exactly what I was worried about, that he'd almost feel a little bit of pressure on his shoulders really, really early in his Chelsea career. Now, thankfully, I do actually think he's made for this sort of level, and I think he can handle it. Like whereas some players maybe would almost hide. I think he's not that sort of player at all. I think he will take it in his stride, but it doesn't stop me sort of worrying about it anyway. In terms of the best wing pairing, it's really tough to drop Neto right now because
Yeah.
as much as he's not doing the best in terms of attacking output numbers and sort of like his efficiency in the final third. He's actually the player for us that's getting the most touches in the final third, and you wouldn't expect, like, he doesn't really replicate that with the output that he gives you. But what he does give you is the intangibles. He's very good off the ball. He's very sort of switched on. He's clever. He knows when to go, when not to go. He's got like a lot of those sort of things that Maresca will love about him. I do think that quite quickly, our most efficient pairing could quite easily become Esteban Garnacho, purely because they give very different things. Esteban being the one to get the ball to feet, really sort of create things off the dribble, whereas Garnacho is that guy who's going to be arriving at that back post, being more efficient with very few touches, so you don't have to afford him those touches that you do for someone like Esteban. So I do think that that could quite quickly become the most efficient pairing, and then maybe your backup being Neto and then Gittins being the one who can create off the dribble a little bit more. Neto who can maybe become a little bit less touch dependent and be a little bit more sort of in that transitional sense and stretching. But I like all four of our wingers. It's just I think it's about finding the balance and allowing especially when you consider Esteban, Gittins, and Garnacho all in that development phase, all earning the trust of Maresca on the job. I do think it's going to take time, unfortunately, which is not what people want to hear. But yeah, I do think if we're talking about best right now, I think it's tough to drop Neto, but I do think quite quickly Esteban Garnacho could be the move.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is just a thought that I had. Obviously, with Quenda coming next summer, one of those four that's here now is going to have to leave. And I'm not saying I want this to happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if Neto's the guy that's sold.
It would make the most sense, wouldn't it? Because he's the one that was bought longest ago.
Yeah.
He's maybe had more time. The only reason I would say maybe not is because I think that with Neto, you can maybe sort of convince him to be a squad player.
Yeah.
Like, I think he's of that ilk, whereas maybe like it'll be tough with the others.
But then who do you let go? That's the thing, though. If Neto stays and
I know.
Esteban's staying, you selling a Garnacho or Gittins after one season. I mean, that wouldn't be a surprise either, given that we know how quickly they move on. So there's decisions to be made. But I agree. Esteban has to be playing right now, and Neto is probably doing more. But Garnacho can certainly force his way in. But we'll round it out there. Guys, thanks for tuning in as always. Make sure you smash the likes. Make sure you subscribe if you're new around here. All of that good stuff. Connor, pleasure as always, mate. Could have talked for ages. Let people know where they can find you.
Yeah, just check me out. My YouTube, Connor Holden Football. Just Connor Holden on Twitter as well, where I post a load of other stuff, just analysis based. Obviously, very focused on Chelsea, but I cover everything. So yeah, thanks for having me on. Good to talk football once again.
Yeah, no, pleasure, mate. Guys, make sure you go and subscribe to Connor. Loads of great content over there. I'll tag his channel in the title. Please make sure you get over there. And yeah, I'll catch you lot again in another one soon.